Well, today we're going to have a look at this rare, low-option, and interestingly equipped 1971 Oldsmobile 98. Now, this is a base 98, not an LS, which would have been the luxury trim for the time. And Oldsmobile had not yet come out with the 98 Regency, which would come out in 1972. So this is really interesting. When you look at the interior of this, you're going to say, that's a 98? It actually looks pretty Spartan on the inside, but the exterior is extremely handsome for a number of reasons. As we walk around the car, you're going to see more. But 1971 was the first year for this all-new full-size platform from General Motors. It would last from 1971 through 1976. And you can see that up front here, this Oldsmobile is displaying some trademark Olds themes that had arisen by this point. The first is that split grille there that I don't know why Oldsmobile decided to introduce that in 1968, but they did, because that was always a Pontiac theme, that split grille, but Olds kind of took it and made it their own, and I think it's a handsome grille. Of course, you've got the orange rocket symbol in the middle, which was patterned off of another luxury marque's emblem. Can you guess whose, if you don't know? If you said Lincoln, you would be correct. That's what Oldsmobile designers patterned that particular variant of the rocket logo after. And you have some interesting kind of headlamp buckets up front. This whole front end portion is formed in sheet molded compound. It's actually not sheet metal, but that portion ahead of the hood cut line is fiberglass. You can also see that this front end has that typical W shape. Take a look at the bumper and you can really see it, where there's, from the plan view or bird's eye view, kind of this W shape where there's a couple points near the headlamps and then one in the center that really just accentuate the front end, make it a little bit more visually interesting than something that was just flat. I have to say, I also love the texture of the grills here, this kind of rectangular pattern that repeats. I think it looks very, very handsome overall, and the turn signals that are integrated in the lower portion of the bumper. And as we rotate around to the side of the vehicle, you can see why I love this particular car so much. It's a 98 that does not have a vinyl roof. That is ultra, ultra rare, and it's single tone. I believe this is Nordic Blue is the name of the color for this particular Olds. And while this is a low option car, you do see that it has the optional cornering lamps up front. For whatever reason, the owner decided that he or she needed those. It does have the wrong wheel covers on it. It has some Oldsmobile wheel covers from later years. But you do see some interesting surfacing on this. Take a look at that front wheel arch and the skeg lines that form in front of and behind the wheel that go all the way down the body side. This kind of out, in theme on those so-called skeg lines. Now, these 71 Oldsmobile bodies were known for having these very smooth sides and quite a bit of tumble home. In other words, the center of the car is the widest portion, and then the car kind of curves inward toward the roofline. And you can notice how curved the side glass is on these vehicles. It's a bit of a challenge, I'm sure, for the engineers to get that glass to go down all the way in the doors. In fact, on these, interestingly, the rear door glass almost goes all the way down. It doesn't go all the way down. It's got like a little sliver that sticks out, probably because of what I just mentioned. That's despite the glass on the rear doors kind of tipping back and then forward as it goes down into the door. It doesn't go straight down. Now, also notice that you have these toothpick A-pillars and you have hardtop glass on the side here. These were the waning years of the hardtops from General Motors. 1976 would be the last year that they would produce a four-door hardtop, and I think these are especially handsome, and despite the fact that hardtops sometimes have challenges with sealing and wind noise, I will say that these vehicles are very quiet on the road. GM did a great job with the road isolation on these. But again, this photo here probably shows the most interesting element being that skeg line appearance on the body side, the lower body side section. Then, of course, you have, starting at the rear door and going rearward, is what ends up becoming a little fin that we'll see now. And here's the rear of this 98 with those little tail fins and vertical tail lamps, something that the 98 had since the 1963 version. And this was really paying tribute to Cadillac, that vertical tail fin that the 98 would have all the way through to the last model year. I should say the vertical tail light would have all the way through to the last model year. And this was true of just the 98. The 88s would have different tail lamps. And again, this was because Olds was trying to emulate Cadillac a little bit here with its most expensive vehicle. Now, again, this one doesn't have a vinyl top, so if you take a look at the corners on the roof, there's no rust. The vinyl tops on these often used to trap moisture, and then it would just become a big challenge against the tin worm with these particular vehicles. But this one appears to have everything in great shape. No bumper guards on the rear either. The chrome bumper is relatively unadorned. This was before the rear impact standard would come into play. I do like the reverse lights that are integrated into that rear bumper. Part of the reason why that was likely able to occur was because there was no rear impact standard, so those little lights could be integrated into the bumper. And here we go with the inside of this Olds 98. Now, this is where you see that this is a low option car. It's got the crank windows. It doesn't have power door locks. It doesn't have air conditioning, interestingly, either, which might be a little bit hard to see in this picture, but is easier to see in one that I'll show of the engine compartment. But again, a very Spartan interior. It does have the tilt wheel, though, and I think that's an AM/FM radio if I can make out the dials there and the controls. So somebody wanted the tilt wheel, cornering lamps, and the AM/FM radio, but they didn't want air and they didn't want power windows. Now, this is all vinyl seating, and again, it looks relatively plain, although you did get an armrest up front. The 88s, you would not get the armrest, so armrest is luxury, I guess. And you kind of have the standard GM fare in terms of the door panel lowers with that padded armrest. I should call it lightly padded armrest there on the door. But overall, a relatively low option vehicle. The 1971 Olds would introduce this driver-centric theme to the instrument panel that was used on all the other GM divisions except the Chevrolets. And it was relatively handsome, kind of had a square speedometer up front. And then the HVAC control would be on the left, the radio control was on the right, which is where it should be. You don't want anybody messing with the temperature control in your vehicle. That should just be for the driver. And here's a picture of the rear seating. Again, you can notice it's relatively plain Jane. There's no clock in the back of that front bench seat like you would get in the LS version vehicles. You can also see the crank windows. I do enjoy the ashtray, the mini ashtray there in front of the padded portion of the armrest because everybody smoked back then, so you had to have a place for your cigarettes. And also check out those belt buckles. I mean, if you kind of whack somebody with that, that would definitely, provide a lot of discomfort, let's say. But everything on these was pretty heavy duty. I will say, though, the previous generation from 65 to 70, I think, were better cars, but these weren't bad vehicles. Some of the quality and the build and fits on these cars weren't that great. This was kind of in those years where GM started to lose it on quality, but this particular car doesn't appear to be too bad. I will also say the door closures on these cars, when you close the doors, they kind of have this rattly sound. It's not that great, especially compared to the previous generation or Fords of the era where the door closures just sounded great. And of course, being an Olds 98, it has to have a huge trunk. These cars rototop 127-inch wheelbase. They're about 226 inches in overall length. When you got the 98, you got the bigger car compared to the 88, which rototop 123-inch wheelbase and was a little bit shorter. Now, this car does appear to have a power deck lid release. I think that's what that little thing is near the latching mechanism. It does also, I think, have a Positraction rear axle. And that is what that yellow sticker is basically a sticker telling you don't jack the car up and put the car in drive, because if you have one wheel off the ground and you put the car in gear with the Positraction axle, it will not be on the jack for all that much longer. But overall, a super clean and huge trunk. You can fit 6 golf bags in here with no issue at all. The vertical height of the fins is definitely helping as well with the depth of the trunk on these. I had a 72 Olds 88, and I thought the trunk was big, but the 98s were even larger. And here we have the Rocket 455 under hood in this Olds 98. This made 325, I believe, gross horsepower, somewhere around 225 net horsepower with single exhaust. As you can see, the owner has added dual exhaust to this particular variant. You can also tell there's no air conditioning compressor on this car. So no air conditioning, just the big old 455 under hood. Unfortunately, 1971 was the first year where these engines were made low compression. They had an 8.5 to 1 compression ratio as opposed to north of 10 to 1. And that made them down on power a little bit, but still tons of torque, 360 pound-feet or so, and moves this car around very smartly. Looks like the owner has fashioned a new master cylinder to the brake booster there on the driver's side. And look at those massive upper control arms. They're just absolutely huge on this car. This car had Oldsmobile's G-Ride system where there were computer-selected springs and shocks depending upon the option content. And I will say the Oldses did ride really well. That was a welcome suspension, let's say, tactic that they employed, which was to have computer-selected springs and shocks. So, all the different options that you had in the vehicles, you could get different weights up front and back, and having one specifically tailored would obviously help with the ride and handling. But again, this was not quite the uppermost end of the Olds range. You got the Tornado in 71. You got a little bit hotter 455, a little hotter cam, standard dual exhaust, made a bit more horsepower, closer to 275 net. So this was not a bad one, but not the absolute upper end of the Olds engine range. Now, before we close this segment out, I want to show this particular photo of a proposal for the 1971 Cadillacs that was shot in GM Design Studios. Now, do you notice something interesting about this front end here? Take a look at those headlamp buckets and bezels, and then the turn signal and parking lamps in the bumper. Does that look familiar? Does it look very similar to the 1971 Oldsmobile 98? Well, this was kind of what used to happen in GM back in the day, was that various divisions would make proposals for their vehicles, and sometimes design management would think, oh, that's appropriate, or other times they would say, geez, go take that and put it on another car. And I think this is an example of a design that perhaps originated in the Cadillac studio, and for whatever reason, it just wasn't thought to be Cadillac-y enough, or wasn't congruent with the overall design theme for Cadillac. And so my guess is that design management said, well, go dump that on the Oldsmobile. Now, there were two senior executives in charge of the studios at this time. I believe one was in charge of Chevrolet Pontiac and the other was in charge of Buick, Oldsmobile, and Cadillac. And those two individuals reported to GM's Bill Mitchell. This was kind of an internal succession plan. Irv Ribicki led one of the groups and Chuck Jordan ran the other. And I believe after some period of time they swapped. So one had the upper end cars, the other had the lower, and then they swapped positions. But my guess is that one of them walked in and saw this front end theme on the Cadillac and just thought, maybe that belongs on the Oldsmobile instead, because clearly there's a striking similarity here. And here's one final sketch of a proposal for the 7198. This is done by longtime GM designer Bill Mahalik. And you can see there's not the vertical tail lamps on this one. And perhaps that's why the proposal wasn't accepted. But I do like the tail lamp treatment in the bumper. And that rear quarter panel form has some elements to me in the bumper as well of the Continental that would come out from Ford. And of course, the main reason I'm showing this is because of the skeg line, that lower portion, that out, in, that you can see going from the front wheel back to the rear wheel. And then you also have, Bill is showing with his shading, that kind of surface with the appropriate radius on the side of the car there. It's not a hard crease. It's just a very smooth surface. And that would also end up on the final Olds 98. So a number of things from these sketches actually made it through to production, and that Cadillac front end treatment, I think that my guess is some GM styling executive or design executive said, take that off of the Cadillac and put it on the Olds. Hope you enjoyed this segment on this Olds 98. What do you think about it? Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.